In 1873, auditors opened Tunisia's treasury and found something impossible. The prime minister had stolen more money than the entire country produced in a decade. The man responsible was Georgios Stravalakis, and 40 years earlier he'd been worth less than a horse on an auction block. This is the story of how a 5-year-old Greek boy who lost everything, his family, his body, his very name, became the most powerful man in North Africa, then destroyed the nation that saved him. Here's the question that'll gnaw at you. How does a child who's worth less than livestock end up controlling more wealth than entire kingdoms? The answer isn't what you'd expect, and it reveals something disturbing about what trauma does to power. If stories like this one matter to you, hit subscribe. It helps us keep digging up the histories that textbooks conveniently forget. Chios, 1817. If you were born on this Greek island, you inherited two things: the scent of mastic trees and the dangerous privilege of living in the Ottoman Empire's richest possession. Georgios Stravalakis arrived into a world that wouldn't let him keep either. His father worked the land. His mother, Irene, kept the household. His brother, Ioannis, played in the same dusty streets where Greek families had lived for generations under Ottoman rule. It wasn't freedom, not by any measure we'd recognize, but it was a life. The Ottomans collected their taxes, the Greeks kept their churches, and everyone pretended the arrangement would last forever. It lasted until Georgios turned 5. In 1821, Greeks across the empire decided they'd had enough of pretending. The War of Independence ignited, and suddenly every Greek island became a potential rebellion. The Ottomans couldn't allow that. They especially couldn't allow it on Chios, where 100,000 Greeks produced the mastic that filled Ottoman treasuries. So, in March 1822, they sent a message that would echo across the Mediterranean for decades. The massacre took 4 days. Ottoman forces moved through Chios like a scythe through wheat. 27,000 Greeks died in those 4 days. But death wasn't the worst fate available. 43,000 more, mostly women and children, were rounded up for the slave markets. The Ottomans understood something brutal. Dead Greeks became martyrs, but enslaved Greeks became profit. Georgios watched his father die. We don't know the details, and maybe that's mercy. What we do know is that 5-year-old Georgios, his brother Ioannis, and his mother Irene were herded onto ships with thousands of other survivors. They weren't prisoners of war, they were inventory. The slave markets of the Ottoman Empire operated with industrial efficiency. Families were separated, mothers sold to one household, children to another. Brothers rarely stayed together, but there was a special category of slave that commanded premium prices, and Georgios fit the profile perfectly. He was young, he was healthy, and he was about to lose something that would guarantee he'd never be a threat to any household he served. They castrated him. Let's be clear about what that meant. This wasn't a metaphor or a historical abstraction. This was a 5- or 6-year-old boy held down while someone cut away his future with a blade. The operation killed more children than it created eunuchs. Adolescents and adults rarely survived it, but young boys had better odds. The Ottomans had refined the procedure over centuries because eunuchs solved a particular problem for elite households. You could trust them with your treasury, your correspondence, your wives. They'd never build a dynasty to challenge yours. They'd never have sons plotting to inherit your position. Georgios survived the operation. Thousands didn't, but he did. And that survival, that refusal to die when death would have been easier, became the defining characteristic of his entire life. He'd survive everything except, eventually, himself. The slave markets operated across the Ottoman world, but the highest quality eunuchs ended up in specific places: Istanbul, obviously, Cairo, and Tunis, where the beys of Tunisia maintained households that rivaled the Sultan's own. Georgios was sold to a merchant who specialized in supplying the Tunisian court. The boy who'd been worth a life in Chios was now worth less than a good horse. But he was worth something, and in the calculations of survival, something beats nothing. The journey to Tunis erased the last traces of Georgios Stravellakis. He wasn't Greek anymore. That identity had been beaten out of him. He wasn't Christian anymore. Conversion to Islam wasn't optional for slaves entering elite households. He wasn't even whole anymore. The ship that carried him across the Mediterranean carried a ghost of the child who'd played in Chios streets 5 years earlier. He arrived in Tunis in the mid-1820s, maybe 1826 or 1827. The city sprawled along the North African coast, a hybrid of Arab, Ottoman, and Mediterranean cultures that had been trading, fighting, and intermarrying for 1,000 years. The Husainid Beys who ruled Tunisia operated with nominal allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan but practical independence. They collected their own taxes, maintained their own armies, and ran their own slave households. And in 1837, something impossible happened. Ahmad Bey, who'd just ascended to power, looked at the enslaved Greek eunuch in his household and made him state treasurer. Georgios was 20 years old. He'd been enslaved for 15 years. He'd been castrated, converted, and stripped of everything that made him who he was. And now he controlled the treasury of an entire nation. We'll come back to why Ahmad Bey made that choice, but first you need to understand what it meant. The position wasn't ceremonial. State Treasurer Khaznadar in Arabic meant you touched every coin that flowed through Tunisia's government. You approved expenditures, collected revenues, managed debts. You knew which officials took bribes, which merchants cheated on taxes, which foreign powers wanted trade concessions. Information was power, and the Khaznadar had all the information. But even that wasn't the full story, because within months of becoming treasurer, Georgios, now calling himself Mustafa Khaznadar, became something else entirely. October the 10th, 1837, Ahmad Bey officially ascended to rule Tunisia, and on that same day he appointed Mustafa Khaznadar as prime minister, not just treasurer anymore, prime minister. The enslaved Greek eunuch who'd been worth less than livestock 15 years earlier now controlled the entire apparatus of the Tunisian state. He was 20 years old. Let that sink in. 20. Most people at 20 are figuring out their first real job. Mustafa was running a country. But here's what makes this moment so psychologically complex. Ahmad Bey wasn't being charitable. He was being strategic. See, Ahmad himself was the son of an Italian slave. The Hassanid dynasty had long ago figured out that family loyalty was dangerous. Blood relatives plotted coups. Sons murdered fathers for thrones. Brothers poisoned brothers for inheritance. But eunuch slaves? They couldn't build dynasties. They couldn't have sons scheming for power. They were, in the cold logic of Ottoman politics, safe. And Mustafa had proven himself brilliant. During his time as private treasurer to Ahmad before the Bey's ascension, he demonstrated something rare. He could navigate the treacherous politics of the Tunisian court without making enemies he couldn't afford. He spoke Arabic fluently now, though Greek still colored his dreams. He'd mastered the elaborate etiquette of Ottoman administration. He understood that power in Tunisia flowed through networks of patronage, tribal alliances, and carefully balanced favors. Therefore, Ahmad gave him everything. Not just the prime minister title, but real power. Within months, Mustafa controlled appointments to the Legislative Assembly. He nominated judges. He approved military promotions. He negotiated with foreign consuls. The Bey signed the documents, but Mustafa wrote them. And Mustafa did something else, something that reveals how completely he'd internalized his transformation. He married into the royal family. Ahmad Bey's sister, Kalthum, became his wife. Think about the audacity of that. The castrated slave married the Bey's sister. It shouldn't have been possible. Eunuchs weren't supposed to marry at all. But Mustafa had become so essential to Ahmad's rule that the normal rules bent around him. The marriage wasn't about love or even desire. How could it be? It was about legitimacy. Every time someone questioned whether a former Greek slave should control Tunisia's government, Mustafa could point to his royal wife. He wasn't just the prime minister, he was family. But the marriage revealed something darker, too. Mustafa was building armor. Every title, every position, every connection was another layer of protection against the vulnerability he'd felt at age 5 when Ottoman soldiers dragged him from his home. He'd learned the most dangerous lesson a traumatized child can learn. Safety comes from power, and you can never have enough of either. Ahmad Bey had his own plans for Tunisia, and Mustafa became the instrument for executing them. The Bey wanted to modernize. He'd seen how European powers were carving up the Ottoman world, and he understood that traditional armies with scimitars couldn't stand against rifles and artillery. So in 1840, Ahmad founded the Bardo Military School, and he sent Mustafa there to learn. Picture this, the Prime Minister of Tunisia, sitting in classrooms learning physics and mathematics from European instructors, learning engineering, artillery tactics, infantry formations. The other students were Tunisian nobles' sons born into privilege, and here was their teacher and classmate simultaneously, a Greek eunuch who outranked their fathers. Mustafa absorbed it all. He understood that knowledge was another form of armor. He studied how European powers structured their militaries, their bureaucracies, their financial systems. He sent Tunisian cadets to France for training. He brought European officers to Tunis as advisors. He was building a modern state, but he was also building something else, a system he could control. Because here's what nobody talks about. Modernization costs money. Those European advisors expected salaries in gold. Those new rifles and artillery pieces didn't come cheap. The Bardo School needed funding. The reformed military needed equipment. And every franc that flowed through Tunisia's government flowed through Mustafa's hands first. He started small, a commission here, a fee there. When foreign merchants wanted trade concessions, Mustafa arranged them for a price. When tribal leaders needed favorable tax assessments, Mustafa could help for a consideration. It wasn't technically illegal. Ottoman officials had always taken commissions. It was how the system worked. But Mustafa took it further. He'd learned something crucial from his time as treasurer. If you control the books, you control reality. And if you control reality, you can make money appear and disappear like a magician's trick. A military contract for 100,000 francs becomes 80,000 in the official ledger, and 20,000 goes into a private account. A tax collection of 500,000 gets recorded as 400,000, and the difference funds a palazzo. And he did build a palazzo. The Khaznadar Palace at Plaza Fouine in the Medina of Tunis rose like a monument to impossible transformation. Renaissance architecture, Italian craftsmen, rooms filled with both Oriental and European furnishings. The enslaved boy who'd lost everything now owned a palace that made nobles jealous. But here's the thing about armor. The more you wear, the heavier it gets. And Mustafa was about to discover that the weight of protection eventually becomes indistinguishable from the weight of a prison. In 1846, Ahmad Bey did something unprecedented. He abolished slavery in Tunisia, first Muslim state to do it 2 years before France. And Mustafa, the former slave, was the prime minister who implemented the policy. The irony should have been redemptive. The castrated Greek boy who'd been sold like livestock was now freeing others from the same fate. But Mustafa didn't see it that way. He saw it as Ahmad's policy, not his own. He implemented it efficiently, professionally, without apparent emotion. Because acknowledging what it meant would require acknowledging what had been done to him. And Mustafa had spent 15 years building an identity that couldn't afford that kind of vulnerability. So he freed Tunisia's slaves and went back to stealing from Tunisia's treasury. The armor got heavier, By the 1850s, Mustafa Khaznadar wasn't just running Tunisia, he was Tunisia. The French consul even tried appealing to his Philhellenic feelings during one negotiation, mentioning a Greek from Chios to remind Mustafa of his origins. It didn't work. Mustafa had buried that Greek boy so deep that mentioning Chios was like mentioning a stranger's childhood. He was Mustafa Khaznadar now, Prime Minister of Tunisia, brother-in-law to the Bey, owner of the grandest palazzo in the Medina. That 5-year-old who'd watched his father die belonged to a different lifetime, but Tunisia's finances told a different story. By 1862, the government owed 28 million piastres. Civil servants hadn't been paid in months. The treasury was bleeding, and Mustafa's solution was the same solution that would eventually destroy everything: borrow more. On May 6, 1863, he signed Tunisia's first ever foreign loan, 35 million francs from a French banker named Erlanger. The terms were predatory interest rates that would make a loan shark blush, but Mustafa signed anyway. He told Ahmad Bey it was necessary for modernization. He told the Legislative Assembly it would fund infrastructure projects. He told himself it was the only way to keep Tunisia afloat. He was lying to everyone, including himself. A significant portion of that 35 million francs never made it to infrastructure projects. It disappeared into the same network of private accounts, kickbacks, and commissions that Mustafa had been building for 26 years. The boy who'd lost everything was making sure he'd never lose anything again, even if it meant bankrupting the nation that had given him everything. But here's where the psychology gets really dark. Mustafa wasn't stealing because he needed the money anymore. His palazzo was built. His fortune was secure. He was stealing because stopping would mean admitting he'd ever started. Each new theft was evidence that the previous thefts had been justified. Each new commission proved that the system itself was corrupt, not just him. He was trapped in a spiral of self-justification that required escalating the very behavior he was justifying. And Tunisia was paying the price. In 1864, Mustafa doubled the mejbar, an already hated poll tax. The official reason was covering the debt service on that French loan. The real reason was that Mustafa and his network of officials were skimming so much off the top that the government couldn't function without squeezing the peasants harder. The peasants didn't squeeze, they exploded. The Mejba revolt of 1864 started in the countryside and spread like wildfire. Tribes that had paid Ottoman taxes for generations refused to pay Mustafa's doubled levy. They saw what he couldn't or wouldn't see, that the money wasn't going to modernization or infrastructure. It was vanishing into the pockets of a Greek eunuch and his cronies. Ali Ben Gudahom led the rebellion. Tribes from across Tunisia joined. The Hamama, Zlas, Methalith, Swasi, Beni Zidnams that meant nothing to Mustafa suddenly meant everything. They weren't just refusing to pay, they were demanding his removal. They were calling him a traitor who'd sold Tunisia to the French. And here's the thing. They were right. Maybe not about the specifics, but about the trajectory. Every franc Mustafa borrowed from French banks came with strings attached. Every loan gave French creditors more leverage over Tunisian policy. Every default gave France more justification for intervention. Mustafa wasn't deliberately selling Tunisia to France, but he was absolutely selling Tunisia. And France was the most enthusiastic buyer. Mustafa fled Tunis in 1864 as the rebellion spread. The prime minister, who'd controlled everything for 27 years, ran like a thief in the night. Because that's what he was. The armor he'd built hadn't protected him. It had just made him a more visible target. The rebellion was eventually crushed. Ottoman-trained troops, the same modern military Mustafa had helped build, turned their European rifles on Tunisian peasants. But crushing the rebellion didn't solve the underlying problem. The tribes were forced to borrow money to pay the fines and tax arrears levied on them for rebelling in the first place. And where did they borrow that money? From the same corrupt officials who'd triggered the rebellion. Then came 1867, famine. The tribes that had been forced into debt couldn't plant crops because they'd had to sell their seed grain to pay Mustafa's fines. The famine killed thousands. And through it all, Mustafa kept taking his commissions, kept approving loans, kept building his fortune while Tunisia starved. But the armor was cracking. By 1869, the whole structure was collapsing. Tunisia's debt had metastasized beyond anything the economy could support. The government couldn't make interest payments. Foreign creditors were threatening military intervention. And the world was about to discover what Mustafa had been hiding for 3 decades. When auditors finally opened the books in 1873, they found something impossible. Mustafa Khaznadar had stolen more money than Tunisia produced in a decade. Let that number sink in. More than the entire country's economic output for 10 years. He'd embezzled funds from every loan, skimmed every tax collection, taken kickbacks from every military contract. His personal fortune was estimated at 50 million francs, while Tunisia's government couldn't pay its clerks. The International Financial Commission was established in 1869 to sort out the mess. Representatives from France, Britain, and Italy took control of Tunisia's finances. They restructured the debt. They imposed new taxes. They effectively turned Tunisia into a financial protectorate before it became a political one. And Mustafa? He kept his position. For 4 more years he remained prime minister while foreign commissioners controlled the actual money. He'd become a figurehead in the government he once dominated, a puppet dancing on strings held by the same French bankers he'd been taking bribes from for years. But the dance was ending. Mohammed al-Sadiq Bey, who'd inherited the throne and the disaster Mustafa had created, was facing impossible pressure. Foreign consuls wanted Mustafa gone. The Tunisian people wanted Mustafa gone. The only question was when, not if. The answer came on October 22nd, 1873. 36 years after becoming prime minister at age 20, Mustafa Khaznadar was dismissed. Not arrested, not executed, just dismissed. Because even in disgrace, he'd accumulated enough connections, enough leverage, enough dirt on enough people that they couldn't simply eliminate him. On December 29, 1873, the Bey ordered Mustafa's property seized. The palazzo at Place Aouin, the one he'd built as a monument to his impossible rise, was confiscated. The fortune he'd spent 36 years accumulating was taken. 2. The armor he'd built, layer by layer, theft by theft, was stripped away. And underneath all that armor was still that 5-year-old boy from Chios, terrified and alone. 20 years ago, he was property. Now he controls the treasury of an entire nation. If that leap doesn't make you stop and think about the cost of that kind of ascent, drop a comment with your thoughts. Here's the thing about transformation stories. We expect them to end with triumph. The enslaved boy becomes prime minister, breaks free from his chains, lives happily ever after. But Mustafa Khaznadar's story doesn't end that way, because his transformation wasn't from slave to free man. It was from victim to perpetrator, from powerless to powerless again. After his dismissal, Mustafa didn't disappear. He couldn't. Tunisia was too small, his presence too large. He'd shaped the country for 36 years, longer than most people's entire careers. He'd built institutions, appointed judges, negotiated treaties. You couldn't erase that legacy by confiscating a palazzo. But you could make him watch what he'd created, and what he'd created was Tunisia's destruction. In 1881, 3 years after Mustafa's death, French troops marched into Tunisia and forced the Bey to sign the Treaty of Bordeaux. Tunisia became a French protectorate, not a colony officially, but a colony in practice. The Bey remained on his throne like a mannequin, while French officials ran everything. It would stay that way for 75 years. And the direct line from Mustafa's embezzlement to French colonization isn't subtle. That 1863 loan from Erlanger, it was deliberately structured to fail. French bankers knew Tunisia couldn't repay those terms. They were counting on it. Because default meant leverage, and leverage meant control, and control meant colonization. Mustafa had signed the treaty that enslaved his adopted nation just as surely as Ottoman soldiers had enslaved him. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so tragic. The boy who'd lost Greece to Ottoman conquest had enabled France to conquer Tunisia. The slave who'd risen to prime minister had helped forge the chains that would bind millions. The victim had become the instrument of others' victimization. But here's what makes his story more than just a morality tale about corruption. Mustafa never stopped being both things simultaneously. Even while he was stealing millions, he was donating land to the Greek Orthodox community. In 1864, the same year he fled the tax rebellion, he gave the Greeks of Tunis 9,995 square meters for a cemetery. The Church of St. George was built there. His mother Irene, who'd survived the Chios massacre and somehow made it to Tunisia, was buried in that cemetery when she died. He brought his mother to Tunis. Think about that. The enslaved eunuch who'd lost everything at age 5 brought his mother to North Africa and cared for her. He maintained those connections to his Greek past even while building his Muslim present. He wasn't a monster who'd completely erased his humanity. He was a traumatized child who'd grown into a complicated, contradictory, ultimately destructive adult. His children, and yes, he had children, through adoption or other arrangements that history doesn't fully explain, carried on his legacy. His son Mohammed studied in Paris under historian Ernest Desjardins from 1863 to 1865. His daughters married into religious families in Algeria and Syria. His son Hassan had descendants who were still living in Tunis generations later. The Khaznadar name didn't disappear with his disgrace. And his cultural contributions weren't erased either. Mustafa was the first person to propose founding a museum at the Bardo Palace. He was a collector, a patron of arts and culture. He understood that Tunisia needed institutions that would outlast any individual ruler. The fact that those institutions would eventually serve French colonial administrators doesn't negate that he tried to build something beyond himself. But it also doesn't excuse what he did. Because here's the final accounting. Mustafa Khaznadar accumulated 50 million francs in personal wealth, while Tunisia's government debt reached levels that triggered foreign intervention. He lived in a Renaissance palazzo, while Tunisian peasants starved in the 1867 famine. He married into royalty, while the nation he ruled slid toward bankruptcy and colonization. On July 26, 1878, Mustafa Khaznadar died in Tunis. Not in exile, as some accounts claim, but in the city where he'd lived for 50 years. He was 61 years old. He'd survived the Chios massacre, castration, slavery, and the transformation into one of the most powerful men in North Africa. He'd outlasted 3 beys. He'd built a fortune, lost it, and watched his legacy crumble. They buried him at Turbat al-Bey, the royal mausoleum. Even in death, he retained the honorific Sahib ud-Dawla, Lord of the State. The boy from Chios, who'd lost his name at age 5, was buried under a Muslim title in a royal tomb in North Africa. If you're looking for a symbol of complete transformation, there it is. But here's what his burial location really tells us. Tunisia never fully rejected him. They could have thrown his body in an unmarked grave. They could have denied him the honors. They didn't. Because for all the damage he'd caused, for all the money he'd stolen, for all the ways he'd enabled French colonization, he was still part of Tunisia's story. You can't understand modern Tunisia without understanding Mustafa Khaznadar. And you can't understand Mustafa Khaznadar without understanding that 5-year-old Greek boy watching his father die. Every theft, Every betrayal, every act of corruption traces back to that moment when he learned the most dangerous lesson: the world will take everything from you, unless you take from it first. He spent 56 years proving that lesson correct. He accumulated power, wealth, titles, a palazzo, a royal marriage, children, a fortune that would have made him one of the richest men in the Mediterranean. And in the end, what did he have? A tomb with someone else's name on it, a legacy of national bankruptcy, and the distinction of being the man who helped destroy the only nation that had ever given him a chance to be more than a slave. The transformation from Georgios Stravellakis to Mustafa Khaznadar was complete. But transformation isn't the same thing as redemption. And survival isn't the same thing as victory. He survived everything the world threw at him: massacre, enslavement, castration, political intrigue, rebellion, disgrace. He survived it all. But he couldn't survive himself. The armor he built to protect that terrified 5-year-old became the weapon that destroyed everything he touched. And that's the real story. Not how a slave became prime minister, but how a victim's unhealed wounds metastasized into national tragedy. How personal trauma, left unexamined and unaddressed, can poison not just one life, but an entire country's future. Mustafa Khaznadar died 3 years before French troops marched into Tunisia. He didn't live to see the final consequences of his corruption. Maybe that's mercy. Or maybe it's the cruelest irony of all, that he died still believing he'd won, still believing the armor had protected him, never understanding that the fortress he'd built was actually a prison, and the only person he'd ever truly imprisoned was himself. Muhammad al-Sadiq Bey stripped him of power and exiled him to Istanbul, where Mustafa Khaznadar died in 1878. Not as a Greek boy, not as a eunuch slave, not even as the prime minister who'd ruled for 40 years, but as the man who'd bankrupted Tunisia so thoroughly that France used it as justification to colonize the entire country just 3 years later. Here's what haunts me about his story. Mustafa spent 50 years building walls of wealth and power so he'd never feel powerless again, and those same walls trapped an entire nation. He survived the auction block, survived castration, survived being property, but he never survived his own fear. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't what the world does to us, it's what we do to the world, because we never healed from what was done to us. Mustafa spent 50 years armoring himself against vulnerability and ended up making millions vulnerable instead. His wounds became someone else's catastrophe. What are you protecting yourself from that might be costing others? Sometimes the hardest question is the one worth asking.